Welcome back. U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen met American businesses in Beijing today on the second day of her four-day visit to China. She's the first Treasury Secretary to visit China in 4 years. Speaking out against the unfair treatment of U.S. companies by China, Yellen said she's concerned about China's latest export curbs. She said China's actions justify America's push to diversify supply chains. Yellen also clarified that U.S. is not seeking to separate its economy from China and stressed that healthy economic competition benefits both sides. Let me now go across to former Indian Ambassador to China, Ashok Kantha. Ambassador Kantha, how do you see this visit? Do you think U.S. is now particularly perturbed by the curbs that China is putting on the export of critical minerals? The tensions between U.S. and China have been ongoing since the time of Donald Trump. But do you think certain recent moves to target American companies in China and then putting curbs on export of minerals is hurting the United States now?
That's part of the story. Earlier this year, one can say that the U.S.-China relations were at the lowest point in several decades. Some effort is being made by both sides to put a sort of floor under the relationship. President Joe Biden has talked about an impending thaw in the relations. We had the visit of Chinese Commerce Minister Wang Wentao to Washington, D.C. in May. Then U.S. Secretary of State Tony Blinken visited China last month. And now we have ongoing visit of U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen to Beijing. The effort is essentially to see that some kind of guardrails are put in the relationship so that differences which are very sharp between China and the USA do not degenerate into conflict. But one is not expecting any breakthrough from the ongoing visit of U.S. Treasury Secretary to China because there are structural problems in the relationship between the two countries. China is convinced that the USA wants to contain and suppress the rise of China, and USA believes that a disruptive China wishes to displace USA as the preeminent power. And, as part of that ongoing strategic contestation, you have trade and technology contestation. USA has imposed curbs on technology exports to China. Earlier, there were tariff imposed by President Trump in 2018, which have been continued by Biden administration. And now China is retaliating. Most recently, they have imposed export curbs on two critical elements, gallium and germanium, which are sort of controlled. The market is controlled by China. But this is a beginning. We'll see more of this kind of thing happening because on its part, USA is also preparing to impose more restrictions, for instance, on FDI inflows from USA into China or access of Chinese technology companies to cloud computing. So this is, a sort of technology war which is unfolding between two countries, which will continue. Janet Yellen, in her remarks earlier today, she said that USA doesn't seek decoupling from China, but they are talking in terms of de-risking and diversifying, and Chinese are not quite convinced that there's a change in U.S. stance. Janet Yellen talks about healthy competition, but competition nevertheless. How this pans out is relatively clear, though both sides are trying to see that.
Kantha?
Yes. Both sides are trying to see that an element of stability is introduced. Yeah, please go ahead.
Okay, an element of stability comes in the relationship. Recently we had seen employees, at least 4 to 5 employees of the Mintz Group, the American company. These were Chinese employees based in China of this American company who were detained. There were employees of Bain & Company in China who were questioned by the Chinese government. The US has also put out advisories telling Americans to be careful while traveling to China because there may be wrongful detention. Do you think this is an element that the US would be really worried about and hoping that this economic coercion, criminal action doesn't take place against American companies and Americans and those working for American companies?
This is a matter of great concern to U.S. companies and indeed companies or the foreign countries as well. You referred to actions taken against employees of mints and Bain & Company. This is part of fairly drastic anti-espionage regulations introduced by China. Secretary Janet Yellen referred to these concerns during her interaction with AmCham, American Chamber of Commerce in Beijing earlier today. Generally, if you look at surveys conducted by US and European chambers of commerce, there is this feeling that the business climate in China has deteriorated and they are operating under considerable pressure, which is getting reflected in some of the investment decisions being taken by these companies in China.
Ambassador Kantha, how do you think Indian companies also face these kind of investigations, these kind of surveys by authorities in China because of our close relationships with the United States, or have the relations not deteriorated to such a level?
No, I'm not aware of any recent case of Indian companies being subjected to similar harassment. There have been instances earlier, but then the business footprint of Indian companies in China is much less compared to the presence of US and European companies. So, their exposure is also relatively limited.
Ambassador Kantha, do you expect the United States to somehow coordinate approaches towards containing China and its economic coercion tendencies with the European Union and also coordinate with India on this?
It's happening already. I think there is a fair amount of strategic clarity in the US national security establishment about what they call pacing threat or pacing challenge posed by China. And the Biden administration is coordinating position closely with the European countries in particular, and to some extent also with India. Earlier, there was talk of decoupling, which is clearly not feasible given the extent of interdependence that we have between China and Western countries in particular. Last year, US-China trade was in excess of $690 billion US dollars. So decoupling is not feasible. So now they're talking more in terms of de-risking and diversifying. US National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan has talked about small yard, tall fence, so that there'll be targeted restrictions imposed on access being given to Chinese companies, especially in high-tech areas, for instance, semiconductors. And this is going to continue. Likewise, at present, there is no talk of tariffs imposed by Trump administration 2018 being reduced or removed. So trade and technology contestation between China and the USA is a fact of life. And this is going to continue even while they manage competition to ensure that conflict doesn't break out. They're also preparing for a possible visit of President Xi Jinping to USA in November this year to take part in APEC summit. There could be a bilateral component to the visit. So that is part of the agenda of high-level communications which are taking place between China and the USA at this point of time.
Right. And US clearly working on more restrictions on US tech trade with China, also putting a limit on advanced chips and US investments in the country, and restrict Chinese companies' access to US cloud computing services as well. Ambassador Kantha, thank you very much for being with us here on Global Eye, putting Janet Yellen's visit, a very important visit to China, in perspective for our viewers. That's all we have for you on Global Eye. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.